Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Battlefield Hardline for PC, Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a first-person shooter developed by Visceral Games with some assistance from DICE and published by EA in March of 2015, and it went on to get pretty much panned across the board. Which is honestly kind of surprising considering that it seems like every single time a Battlefield game comes out, everybody seems to think it's the best thing since sliced bread, when in reality they pretty much haven't made a good game in the series since Battlefield 2. Which brings me to Hardline, because Hardline is a very different game than what we're used to in the Battlefield series. Instead of being focused on inane modern military shooter crap, this is actually focused on the so-called war on crime, or as I just like to call it, cops and robbers. Which brings up two questions, the first of which is how does that actually affect the game, and the second is why isn't this its own IP instead of piggybacking off of Battlefield? Let's go ahead and delve into this thing and find out. Now, as far as the presentation goes, it does run on the Frostbite engine, and in some spots it looks pretty great. Namely things like the special effects, the amount of detail on characters, for example, where if they're sweating you'll actually see the sweat glistening on them and everything. The weather and lighting effects, those sorts of things all look really good, but then there are the elements of the visuals that don't succeed quite as well, like the texture quality, which is mostly fine, it's just it's kind of hit or miss here and there, and some of the textures look positively last gen. And then there's the animations, which are mostly actually very well done. It's just the first-person animations are pretty awful in a lot of spots. I mean, a lot of them just look positively amateur and don't even look remotely like how people would actually handle firearms. Beyond that, there is the sickeningly low FOV. The single player is locked at whatever FOV it's set at. I'm not sure what it is because it is a vertical FOV setting, but I feel like it's right around 50 to 55 degrees horizontal because it is nauseating to play. I actually cannot play the single player in this for longer than about 10 minutes before I start to feel sick to my stomach. And that is quite simply not acceptable. Not only does it make me and other people who are sensitive to FOVs nauseous, but it also means you can't actually see what you're doing half the time. You have basically no situational awareness, so there'll be plenty of instances where you end up getting killed and you're like, wait a minute, who just shot me? I couldn't tell. Of course, that issue is compounded by the sheer amount of bugs and glitches that are in this thing. For some baffling reason, they never really patch those out, so you'll end up with situations like this. And even when the game isn't doing weird stuff like that, it has frame rate issues. All of the cutscenes are locked at 30 frames a second, and they're pre-rendered. This means that you are constantly switching back and forth between what is basically an uncapped frame rate and 30 frames a second, and it looks awful during those transitions. And if you're running a high refresh rate monitor, it's going to look especially bad in that regard. Now, once you get past the visuals in the performance department, you have sound design, which is thankfully mostly good, at least in 2 out of 3 aspects. Most of the explosions have a lot of nice beefy bass to them, so they actually knock you around a bit and they sound great as a result. The gunfire sounds pretty solid, and it tends to echo throughout the maps appropriately. That's something that both Visceral and DICE have done a very, very good job with. If there is one thing I can praise about the Dead Space series, it is the sound design, and that is something that Visceral has also excelled with here. Slightly less success can be attributed to the voice acting, which is very well done. They got some very competent people to play the various characters, it's just that the writing is just garbage. So while the actors did do what they could with what they had was just crap to work with, so there's only so much they could have done with it. But then there's the one thing that they failed miserably on, and that is the soundtrack. Now you have to keep in mind that you have to split this between 2 separate soundtracks. There's the original soundtrack, which is completely forgettable, although it's not actually that bad. It's a bunch of electronic mixed with guitar, and it fits the vibe that they're going for, which is sort of a cop show vibe, but it's, again, completely forgettable. So what you're really gonna notice are the licensed tracks, where you can play them through the radio, or they'll come up in the campaign at certain intervals. And the vast majority of them are complete shit. Don't get me wrong, there are a couple of decent tracks in the soundtrack, but the rest were either so bad they made me want to turn off the music, or were so bad they made me want to drive spikes through my ears so I wouldn't ever have to hear them again. Namely the one that has the Jamaican sounding, I don't think is actually Jamaican, but he sounds like it, doing whoop whoop all the time. It never ceases to amaze me what people seem to think is good music. But you know what? As ridiculously cliche as this game is, I'm surprised they didn't throw in friggin' Bad Boys by Inner Circle. And you know what? At least that tune's catchy. Most of the tracks in this are just irritating. And they are actually enough to drag down the entirety of the sound design as a whole, so it's really quite a shame that their soundtrack selection was so crappy in so many ways. But of course presentation isn't everything, and what really matter here are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this is that you play as Nick Mendoza, a detective of Vice Squad in Miami who is going after cocaine in the city. At the beginning of the game he's involved in a drug bust that goes wrong and ends up getting transferred to a different partner, and they start investigating the source of cocaine in the city, only to find that their investigation becomes more complicated when it starts to involve dirty cops and the like. And while the presentation is rather slick and is made up to look like a TV show where you have different episodes being the different levels of the game, and when you start the game up it'll say previously on Hardline and go through a quick summary of what was going on before, and whenever you exit the game it'll say next up on Hardline and give you a taste of things to come. Unfortunately, they forgot that presentation isn't everything, and the actual writing in this game is frickin' terrible. The dialogue is stiff most of the time, the one-liners simply fail miserably, and so you end up with a distinct lack of personality, when personality is what could have actually saved it from the writing itself just being complete crap. It's like they just took a bunch of cop show cliches and threw them into a blender and said, you know what, we don't even care what comes out, let's just roll with it. And what you end up with is a cliched, predictable mess of a story with characters who are just bland and uninteresting. But when you throw in the gameplay on top of that, you end up with a complete disaster of a single-player campaign. Remember, you're supposed to be a police officer, which would mean, of course, arresting people rather than killing them, except this is a first-person shooter, so obviously you have to mow down bad guys in droves instead of actually, arresting them. But the game does act like you have a choice because you have the optional stealth system as well as the arrest mechanic. You see, the stealth system involves you crouching and moving around and throwing shell casings at places in order to distract enemies. The problems with that being that the stealth itself just barely even functions, and the throwing of shell casings has a ridiculously short range, so it actually can get you in trouble more often than not. What can't get you in trouble is your partner, who will waltz through a group of enemies and they won't even notice they're there. No, really. Look at this.
I saw some movement over there.
Now, obviously I don't expect the goons to be the most intelligent people around, but come on. That's just pathetic. And speaking of pathetic mechanics, the arrest mechanic, where you can hold up your badge and say, freeze! And it will stop up to 3 enemies in their tracks, and they'll all drop their weapons and hold up their hands. And as long as you keep your gun pointed at them, they won't do anything, which allows you to move in close and arrest them in a canned takedown animation that is accompanied by the same 2 sets of grunting sounds every single time. Now, of course, your partner is supposed to keep their weapon trained on the other guys if there are multiple perps, so you don't end up getting shot in the face, but it's pretty much a crapshoot as to whether or not that's actually going to work, and you need to work fast if you're going to attempt to arrest the enemies, instead of simply knocking them out by sneaking up behind them, or just, shooting them in the face. Oh yeah, and you are given only a limited amount of ammunition, so you need to be pretty frugal with it. Luckily, there are various tactical gear boxes set up throughout the levels that allow you to change your loadout, which is of course unlocked over time by simply leveling up or by finding the various weapons scattered around the levels in the hands of bad guys. You can also complete investigations in order to get the various weapons that are available to you. Now, if you want to know what that involves, it is quite literally pressing a button to bring up a scanner and then holding the mouse button while you're looking at an item of evidence in order to scan it in, and that's literally all you need to do. No questioning, no actual investigating, just look at things, scan into evidence, you are done. I mean, investigating is what detectives do. They don't just go around looking for evidence with a handy-dandy magic scanner. They piece things together. There could have been some puzzle solving, there could have been some questioning that you had to do, but nope, it's just a first-person shooter, you got a run and gun, and that's about it. They do occasionally try to spice things up with, for example, a driving section, but the controls really don't feel very good, and the driving itself ends up just being incredibly boring. Although they do throw in a boss fight where you fight against a guy in a tank with your own tank, which should tell you pretty much everything you need to know about Hardline, frankly. The developers were so concerned with, hey, what could we possibly do with this, that they didn't stop to think, hey, wait a minute, should we do that? And of course the answer is no. You really shouldn't have Visceral. The more you play the single player, the worse it gets, and it makes something very abundantly clear. The developers were actually shackled by the fact that this was supposed to be a Battlefield game. Here's the problem. Battlefield really only works well when it's military versus military. In the case of a cops and robbers sort of game, it's just not applicable. And what you end up with is a complete disaster of a single-player campaign and multiplayer that feels completely out of place for the theme. Now, they tried to make it more fitting with the theme, but what you end up with, instead of a feeling of cops and robbers, is a feeling of two paramilitary organizations going up against each other. I mean, don't get me wrong, the police departments of the US are unnervingly militarized, but they're not so militarized that they have helicopters with miniguns mounted on them. And the game modes themselves just don't really do anything to pick up the slack. You have the basic conquest mode, which is pretty much exactly what you would think of at this point from Battlefield, as well as a bunch of fairly unique modes like Blood Money, where there's a vault filled with cash that you have to steal money from and bring back to your vault, regardless of which team you're on. The excuse they make is that the Leos are collecting it as evidence, whereas the criminals are obviously just trying to get away with as much money as they can. It's a pretty flimsy excuse, and that's pretty much exactly how all the other modes go as well. You have the Hotwire mode, where it's basically just conquest, only instead of the points being fixed on the map, they're a bunch of vehicles that you have to drive around at a certain speed, and they just end up being tedious, as well as fairly nonsensical if you're playing as the Leos instead of the criminals. And of course there's Crosshair, which is your basic VIP mode. Leos are trying to protect a VIP, whereas the criminals are trying to take them out. And then there's the basic Team Deathmatch mode, which is exactly as it sounds. The Rescue mode, where the Leos try to rescue some hostages, whereas the criminals try to prevent them from doing that. And then of course there's the Heist mode, which is pretty much exactly as it sounds. The criminals are trying to get a couple of cash bags and get them out of the level, whereas the Leos are trying to stop them from doing that. All the while, you are dealing with the weapon handling mechanics of Battlefield 4, only without the fixes that they implemented later on in that game's life cycle, like, say, I don't know, 60 Hz servers, which means that there's still the lag problems that have plagued the Frostbite engine. So you still have to get used to how each weapon handles, but then you also have to put up with the fact that even if you get used to how that weapon handles, you may not actually get a kill because the game is like, no, that person was behind cover, instead of actually out in the open like you saw on your screen. Which is particularly annoying if you're using one of the weapons that's supposed to be a one-shot, one-kill kind of thing, like the sniper rifles, which are actually rather hard to use in this game because there really aren't all that many maps where they're good. Hardline tends to focus a lot more on CQB and mid-range combat, which is terrible if you're trying to be a sniper, so you end up having to use the carbines, the assault rifles, the SMGs, and the like, and that brings up a pretty significant problem that this game has. The classes in this are more restrictive than Battlefield 3 and 4's were. No longer do you have universal secondary weapons, nor do you have really all that many universal primary weapons. Now you're dealing with 4 classes, each of which has a specific weapon set as well as a specific gear set. So you have the operator replacing the assault class. They use assault rifles and carbines and have all the medical gear, and they also have your basic semi-automatic pistols. Mechanics replace engineers, only they don't get rocket launchers anymore, but rather grenade launchers, as well as submachine guns and revolvers. The Enforcer class replaces the Support class, only they don't get machine guns anymore, they get battle rifles, which are just basically heavier assault rifles, the 7.62s instead of the 5.56s, and shotguns. And lastly, there's the Professional, which replaces the Recon class. They use sniper rifles and DMRs, and they also get machine pistols. Now, of course, each class also has its own gadgets and gizmos that it needs to use. Obviously, the Operator class is your medic, your Mechanic has stuff related to vehicles, the Enforcer has ammo boxes and explosives and that sort of thing, and Professionals are really more about scouting and such. But unlike in, say, Battlefield 4, where you had a great deal of customization options, in Battlefield Hardline you really don't. There's a fair degree of camos and attachments that you can get, but the actual weapons themselves are relegated to the various classes, and they require you to get a bunch of cash in order to be able to purchase them. Luckily, cash is earned by simply getting points in the game, and it's a 1-to-1 ratio. The more cash you get, the more weapons you can buy, the more attachments you can buy. The problem being that you have to unlock the attachments first, which is kind of weird when you consider that you can buy any weapon that you want in that specific class as long as you have the cash to get it. So as an example, let's just say that you wanted to get the M98. Well, you can certainly do that as long as you have the cash for it. You pay up the cash, you get the weapon, and you can basically just go about it as you see fit. The thing is, in order to be able to really customize it, you're going to have to get a bunch of kills with it. So the way that works is after 20 kills you get optics. Now, this does only unlock the ability to purchase those optics, but unlike in previous Battlefield games where you basically just got different optics and different attachments as you got different levels of kills, in this it unlocks every single one of the optics and allows you to purchase which one you want with the cash that you're earning in-game. Now, as annoying as that is, and as unbalanced as that can be, at least it's a step in the right direction for the unlock system of the Battlefield series, because up until now, the unlock system has been pretty terrible and unbalanced. Oh, don't get me wrong, it's still unbalanced as hell, it's just not quite as horribly unbalanced as previous Battlefield games. Now, also a step in the right direction is the amount of loadout slots you get. You get a bunch of different loadout slots per class, and those allow you to configure that class in a specific way for specific situations. This is definitely better than having to basically scramble every single time that you're trying to set up your class to meet the situation at hand, and you can just quickly switch between the ones you need to switch between. Now, here's a problem with that. Say there's something that you really like about a certain class. Say you really like, I don't know, the CZ-75 for the Operator class. Well, there's a problem with that. You see, it's a weapon that is specifically for the criminal side, and that means that if you want to get it on the Leo side, then you need to undergo a challenge of getting, I believe, 1,250 kills with it in order to be able to actually use it on the other team. Oh, and the best part about that? That is for every single faction weapon in the entire game. Every single one has the same exact challenge of getting that many kills in order to be able to use it as the other team. It is incredibly stupid. I mean, seriously, if you're gonna do something like that, then you might as well just not make it available to the other team at all. If it's a tedious slog, then why would you bother doing it? Oh wait, I know exactly what they were going for with it. They wanted you to buy the shortcut packs. Much like they also want you to buy battle packs for it. And honestly, that's a pretty despicable business practice. But honestly, who's surprised by that at this point? At this point, it's just depressing. And really, that's the vibe you get from Battlefield Hardline in general. It's just like a watered-down version of Battlefield with less stuff in it. There's not tanks, there's not jets. You just end up with a bunch of cars, a couple of armored cars, and helicopters, and less gear options than you would in a normal Battlefield game. They try to spice things up by allowing you to use grappling hooks and zip lines, but really that doesn't help all that much. And the end result is a game that's basically a cash grab. If you've played Battlefield 4, there is literally no reason to play Battlefield Hardline. If you've played Battlefield 3, there is no reason to play Battlefield Hardline. And if you haven't played any of the more recent Battlefield games, well, Battlefield 4 may still suck, but at least it's a better value proposition than this. There's a rather low amount of content on offer here, and as crappy as the single player is, the multiplayer really isn't much better. Trying to transplant Battlefield's gameplay into a cops and robbers setting just doesn't work. It is constantly at odds with the setting, and what you end up with is something that feels like a total cash grab. And honestly, the only reason I even bothered picking this up is because EA was releasing the DLCs for free. And the sad part is, even with the DLCs, the amount of content on offer does not justify the asking price. Especially considering that content on offer is just garbage. Well-presented garbage, mind you, but it's still garbage. Pretty much nobody plays Battlefield for the single player, and the multiplayer in this is just a joke. It's boring, it's buggy, and the player count is dropping. No matter what DLC EA throws around for free, it's not gonna stop the game from being a piece of crap. And the fact that even the diehard Battlefield fans pretty much abandon this thing right from the get-go speaks volumes for that. I give it a 1 out of 5. Thanks for watching.